it's your friendly neighborhood sassy blonde writer coming at you with another writing video. Today we are continuing our discussion on story structure by talking about one that you've probably seen a lot, especially in TV shows and movies, but you've probably never heard the name before, and that is in medias res. I have no idea if I'm saying that correctly because it's Latin, but it's also known as in the midst of things story structure. Again, this is all a part of my story structure series, so if you've missed any of those videos, don't you worry about a thing. It is linked down below any of those other videos that you may have missed. So make sure you check those out. This is probably the most unconventional of the story structures that we're going to talk about because of the way it unfolds. Now, you probably guessed from the title, in the midst of things, that the way the story starts is in the middle of the story and then you kind of work backwards a little bit. This is honestly a lot more common than you would think. It comes from Latin for in the middle of things. So this type of structure refers to a narrative work beginning in medias res, or in the middle of things. So it opens in the middle of the plot. So a lot of times exposition is completely bypassed, or it's filled in gradually either through dialogue, through flashbacks, or through descriptions of past events. So now let's do a little overview on the plot structure.
Alright, so now let's talk about a medias res story structure. So, like I said before, it starts off with the hook. After your hook, you go into your rising action and explanation. As I said before, your rising action can be interwoven with going into flashbacks and your setup and your inciting incident and all that fun stuff. Bring you from the actual chronological beginning of your story to the event from the hook, which was usually plot point 1, then into the midpoint reversal. Then we're still in the rising action, and depending on how you're telling your story here, you interweave some more flashback. Then from the rising action, you're going to build up to plot point 2, which could also be, depending on what overall story structure you're going with, your climax or your confrontation, the most dramatic point of your story. Then you have the falling action, and you can always interweave some more explanation and backstory, but usually after the climax, that's when everything sort of comes together. So you can put some more explanation and backstory in there as well, but you don't have to. A lot of times authors don't do that with the falling action just because the falling action is a really short part of the book. There's not really that much time because you kind of gotta wrap everything up. And then of course you have your resolution.
If you are a discovery writer, this may be the story structure for you. Usually what happens is you start with some big chunk of action happening in the story because you're coming in the midst of things, right? Which, if you're a discovery writer like me, is your bread and butter. You're like, yes, that is exactly how I want to start my story. Because a lot of times starting at the beginning with the setup and everything is really boring. For a story structure that isn't really talked about, it's a lot more common than you would think. It's basically any story that starts in the middle of the plot and then works backwards, right? So it comes up in books, like Margaret Atwood is very fond of this trope. Like The Handmaid's Tale is a prime example where Offred tells her story in flashbacks as she's going through, as she's just like kind of existing in Gilead's house, in Gilead present day. She's telling her story and like how Gilead came to exist. Toni Morrison also uses this type of structure a lot. A lot of times Toni Morrison's books usually tell their stories out of order, which is one of the things that's really cool about reading her books. Fluid Eye. It's really interesting to read from a narrative perspective. She also does this in her novel Paradise. Begins with the phrase, "They shoot the white girl first," which is the epitome of the story structure. Honestly, Toni Morrison is probably the queen of this type of story structure. Catcher in the Rye also starts off with Lynn Caulfield being hospitalized and then telling the psychologist of the events that led up to him being hospitalized. So very common with movies. It is very typical for a film noir type of movie to begin in medias res. For example, the private detective will enter with things already like in the middle of everything. Citizen Kane literally starts with Charles Foster Kane from the title dying all by himself and muttering the words Rosebud, and then his entire story is told through flashbacks. So you start basically at the end and then have to work backwards to find out what his last words mean. Forrest Gump features Forrest talking about his life with people waiting for him at the bus stop. Goodfellas begins with Henry, Tommy, and Jimmy disposing of a dead body and flashes back to Henry's childhood, and we follow him until he reaches this point again around the middle of the film, and then we watch what happens afterwards. Ratatouille opens with Remy crashing through a glass window with a book over his head, and then the first part of the film spent explaining how he got to that predicament. And Emperor's New Groove also does this as well, where it begins with a sad llama sitting all alone in the middle of the rainstorm, and then Cusco's voiceover informs us that the llama was once the emperor. And the first half of the movie focuses on how he got there, and then, yeah, there you go. It's a little bit differently in books versus movies. So a lot of times, books kind of intertwine flashbacks with present, kind of weave flashbacks with present day events, and kind of go back and forth to build the narrative when they use this structure. However, movies, a lot of times, they start with something happening and then flashback, usually using voiceover, to the events leading up to what they showed you at the beginning, and then move forward from there for the rest of the film. So it's really interesting to see how they do that. TV shows, it depends on the TV show. It could really go either way. And then like I was saying before, the TV shows use this a lot. As mentioned before, it's really good at grabbing people's attention and shock value. When you use this type of structure for a TV show, it's essentially the opposite of a cliffhanger. Right, for example, in the opening scene of Vince Gilligan's Breaking Bad, as I mentioned before, the viewers are thrust into the unforgiving New Mexico landscape of the soon-to-be infamous Walter White, in only his underwear. What? As he drives an RV through the desert. When he comes to a stop, he hurries out of the vehicle, throws on his shirt, and by the time we reach the end of the cold open, he's pointing his gun to the sound of approaching sirens. That is the high adrenaline opening that hooks in the audience and keeps them interested even through the not so exciting parts in anticipation of finding out what happened. That is what you're thinking the entire time you're watching the first episode. The Sopranos also uses this narrative structure, but the way they use it for the pilot episode, instead of the coming in the middle of something being the action, you are in the middle of Tony Soprano's first ever therapy appointment. And so the whole time you're like, Tony Soprano is a mobster and he's going to therapy. And then you find out Tony Soprano's having panic attacks. And then what's really interesting is as the therapy session goes on, it's actually a brilliant device because the way the therapist has to ask questions, then it cuts to flashbacks and then Tony has to answer in a way that doesn't put the therapist in a legally difficult situation because everything he tells her is privileged information because of doctor-client privilege. However, if someone's life is in danger or if it's a crime that's going to be committed, she does have to call the police. At least I think that's what they say in the show. I forget the actual thing. The opposite of what you think of when you think in the midst of something. Shush. And believe it or not, this also happens in musicals too. So it's not as common in musicals or stage plays as it is in other forms of storytelling, but it does happen, believe it or not. So Steven Sonheim's show Symphony opens during Bobby's 35th birthday party, and the story itself is presented as little vignettes of the lives of Bobby's married friends. His birthday party also being a frequent link in between. The little vignettes are not presented in any chronological order, although they take place before the day of the birthday party, so like they just kind of happen. So the final scene again takes place at the party. Another example is the film adaptation of Camelot uses in medias res, while the original Broadway version did not, although after the film version, then a lot of stage adaptations were like, ooh, that's a good idea, and then they started doing that too. So Wicked does that as well. But Wicked is an interesting case because we already knew the ending because it's The Wizard of Oz, so the end is an event the audience probably already knows, but then it goes on to tell the events leading up to it in a completely different way and like focuses on the side characters from the original story. So Wicked does that too. TLDR, works that employ in medias res, a lot more common than you think, and a lot of times they later often use flashback and non-linear narrative for exposition to fill in the backstory. So what makes this story structure work? It's all about the hook. Remember, the hook is just a device that you, as the author, are going to use to get your reader interested when you start your novel. But nobody said that it had to start at the chronological beginning of the story, right? Big brain time. Ask yourself, what is the hook for your novel? Where do you think the hook comes in? Do you have a hook at the chronological beginning of your novel, or do you think you're better off telling your story a little bit out of order, starting in the midst of things? So how do you figure out if this is the story structure to use for your story? The way you figure that out is which part of your story feels like it would draw the reader in the most. I recently went through this type of question with my current manuscript. I tried to write a regular beginning where I set everything up. I tried to write, after trying to write this type of story structure, because I felt like I was supposed to start chronologically with the beginning, but this type of story structure in medias res is the best way for me to write this story. That's all I got for you today, folks. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure you give a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe. I post new videos on Wednesdays, and of course, happy writing!